Welcome to another episode of the Clarity Digital Podcast. I'm your host, Al Sefati, and today we're joined by the amazing Paige McCrensky. In this episode, we dive into the fascinating intersection of data, storytelling, and marketing innovation. We'll explore topics like the power of authentic brand values, understanding cultural nuances, and how to leverage AI for personalization while staying ahead in an ever-changing industry. Let's get started. Hello, how are you, Paige? Thank you for joining us on our podcast.
Hi, Al. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I appreciate you and your time. I enjoyed both of your sessions at Digital Summits where we met, and I'm like, I gotta have you on our podcast. So I would love for you to introduce yourself for our audience and just about your background and your previous and current role in marketing and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So
Thank you.
I've spent my career in marketing. I can totally date myself and say it's been over 50 years. Oh my God, 20 years in marketing. I have worked at a variety of different companies. Most recently, I was vice president of sales, marketing, and brand communications at Getty Images for the Americas. And there it was all about storytelling and how do you connect with consumers to engage? How do you differentiate your brand? How do you connect all under the umbrella of driving revenue? So I worked there, but I've also worked at Bloomberg and American Express. I did some digital startups, a company called Martini Media, which was all about engaging the affluent online through a network of an affluent audience. I've worked at Rappaport and I started my career at Ogilvy. So at the genesis of who I am, it really starts from working at an ad agency that really put training and understand consumer behavior at the heart of it. But one geeky thing about me is I am a research addict. I love data. And I think understanding data and having your kind of finger on the pulse of what's happening in culture and how that changes so quickly, and then taking that data to use and understand insights to tell your stories is what I love. So really keeping on top and reading and understanding data and using that. And I've done that throughout my career.
That's awesome. And I know data is backbone to storytelling, and it's just not just the data, right? The questions you ask and how you present that data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should have said I recently just started my own consulting company called the Storytelling Catalyst Group because I think in today's attention economy, really the only way to connect and get consumers, even B2B targets to kind of stop the scroll or read the email is to connect with a story that's relevant. So really I'm excited to start working on that and help brands connect with their audiences doing
Mhm.
what I love, but it all comes back to the data.
Yeah, that's great. So how do you tell a story from a raw data? How do you translate it into a consumable information? And do you tell the same story to all the audience, or do you shift your tone to
Yeah.
different audience?
Yeah, I think the one size fits all strategy doesn't work anymore. And especially with AI and how you can really automate personalization through AI, it really takes on a whole new level. The challenges with AI, though, is that the personalization can be off
Mhm.
and not quite as relevant. So that's where the data comes in. So I'm a huge reader of and components. I'm looking at Kantar, I'm looking at McKinsey, I'm looking at Deloitte, I'm reading articles, I'm looking at a lot of the agencies, the trend reports to kind of understand what's happening now and segmenting that. And the segmentation can be looked at through a lot of different ways. Some people look at segmentations on lifestyle, demographics. One of the areas that I've been really focused on is generational data. So looking at generational marketing and understanding values of a specific audience and then tailoring the personalization based on that is a way to break through. So really understanding how a Gen X cares about things and likes to be spoken to with very factual, a little bit more nostalgic at times, to a boomer that just wants the facts, to a Gen Z that wants interaction, involvement, humor, relevance about the environment, about inclusion. And understanding those nuances and then tailoring, whether it's social media, whether it's email marketing, whether it's sales materials, even making sure the tone and the language is helpful. So the story needs to be based on what's going to connect with the segment that you're going after. And yeah, one size doesn't fit all. And AI helps and can accelerate it, but it can't do it without understanding that intrinsic can't even talk right now. The really what's important to the recipient so that you can connect, because I think right now the stats are attention span is 8%,
Mhm.
and that's down 4 points from just 4 years ago. And
Wow.
the average, I think we check our phone 114 times a day.
Mhm.
When you think about B2B marketing, that's probably increased because you've got not just your social interaction, but your business interaction. So in order to get somebody to stop and connect, it needs to be relevant and speak to who that person is.
There was a bunch of really good stuff that you were talking about, and I, for one, can admit that the ecosystem, at least when we focus a lot on search marketing and social marketing, and we've seen the trends changing quite a bit, like in the world of SEO, for example, and search marketing. Lots of informational searches now being kind of lost to either the LLMs, Chat GPTs and
Yeah.
Geminis, or TikTok and YouTube. You can't have a one size fit all. You have to understand your audience and what they care about and what tools they use. My question to you is that how do you go about understanding, how do you get that data?
Yeah, I have my Google alerts for companies
Mhm.
that I follow. I do a lot of reading. I'm on all the social platforms, to see what's going on. Without a doubt, TikTok accelerated the culture. And sometimes if you wait too late, you miss it. But also, you don't need to jump on every bandwagon, because if it's not relevant to what you're doing, it may not be in sync with what your brand or your brand messaging is. But it's a lot of just really staying relevant, doing a lot of reading, understanding a little bit deeper, what's the trend versus what's the value, and kind of finding the crossover of both of those.
And versus value. That's amazing. And that's kind of talking about being authentic, all right? Values. That's what will drive authenticity if
Yeah,
you.
it's all about authenticity, and it's really interesting because what is authentic has changed. What was authentic 10 years ago, 20 years ago versus today. I was at Getty for over 7 years, and so visual storytelling and the importance of visual is so part of my DNA now of how I look at everything. We process visuals and images 90% faster than copy. It can automatically draw that emotional connection, which drives authenticity. So, understanding the visuals you're choosing to get you to stop and your values is really important. And when you look at specifically from general generations, when you look at what's happening in the world, that is affecting what is authentic and what it means. So, looking now of what's happening right now with a new administration coming in, with climate changing, with different terminology being used, how does that represent what is authentic right now? I remember when I was at Getty, when the pandemic hit, I think within 2 weeks, we got images of people with masks or streets being empty. You'd watch a commercial back in 2020 or 2020, 21, and people were hugging, and you'd like cringe, right?
Mhm.
And you're like, God, this brand doesn't get it, because that's not how we're living right now. So it's really important to understand what is authentic right now versus what was authentic 6 months ago, and really being aware of what's going on. Visuals are a great way to do that, but it's in language as well, like making sure you're really understanding, when there's a financial crisis. We've seen changes in the way that women or men are portrayed in visuals or stories, when it's about luxury being understated versus a little bit more showy, I guess would
Mhm.
be the word, and really understanding what's happening in that timeline helps what authentic is. And then again, thinking of generations, what authentic to me as a Gen Xer may be a little bit different than my daughter, who's 21, and what she thinks is authentic, and making sure you kind of understand that. But if it's not coming from the heart or a good place, people know. And that's where you have to be careful with AI.
Yeah, and kind of goes along with the brand loyalty. Is that is that a necessary factor if you want to for your clients or customers to be, loyal to your brand? Do you
Yeah.
have?
So one of the things that's interesting about Gen Z, and Gen Z is the first, native digital
Mhm.
consumer and audience, and they have such effect. As I said, I have a 21-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old daughter. Their behavior is rubbing off on me. And for them, brand loyalty is really different. They will switch and are open to other brands. I think 75% of Gen Zers are open to looking at other brands. So that means that less than 25% are brand loyal. They also look at what a brand is, like what are your values? How do you
Mhm.
stand on sustainability, on inclusion? What are you giving back? What's your community like? They also look at digital versus in-store versus events as all the same thing. So there needs to be that consistency. So it's hard to get brand loyalty with that audience versus Gen X, millennials, brand loyalty. If you deliver and you meet what you say, you have, I think, over 50% of brand loyalty versus it's tougher with the younger consumer right now.
That's great. Where do you see cultural differences? We live in a very diverse country, and I'm myself Middle Eastern, and people come from different background. Even if they grew up here, in my case, they migrated here when they were like young. Where do you see how is that impacting or making it more complicated to understand your target audience?
Yeah, I think one of the things that there's been a shift. I remember years ago working and it was all about multiculturalism and kind of blending everyone, together a little bit. Now it really is understanding the nuances between all of us, and people
Hmm.
want to be seen
Sure.
and be seen that we all have. You look at me and you're like, she's a woman, she's a brunette, she's a mom, but it's not really in taking all the other aspects of me, all the different lenses of identity and celebrating them all. I did this big program actually when I was at Getting Images with City, and it was called the DE&I Storytelling Guidebook, and it's open source, and I'm happy to share it with you to share with your audience as well. But basically, it was looking at 9 markets globally and looking at what does the demographic look like in that market, and then
Hmm.
what are we seeing in media and advertising, and where there are gaps, and how there are opportunities and questions people want to buy when they see themselves as buying the product. And there can be an aspirational part of that too. But, when you look at India, for example, and a lot of the advertising that we saw featured only light skinned women. And the reality is that most women in India and most people in India have a broad range of skin tones, but yet beauty and different aspects were all highlighted more with that. So if you want to make your messaging a little bit more understandable to a wider audience, that's something to think about. There's also a lot of cultural nuances. It's not like everybody fits in one. And I think it's really important to understand that. And that's where you get brand loyalty. There's actually proven metrics. The Unstereotype Alliance, which is part of UN Women, and See Her, which is part of the ANA, both came out with metrics that show when you represent people as they are and break stereotypes and speak to them with those cultural nuances, your purchase and revenue will be on the upside.
This is amazing insight. I do have a question on in marketing, most marketers, we tend to go out of our way to resonate and personalize our messages with our target audience, with our customers. But the buck doesn't stop there, right? It's after the delivery of the product, the customer service, the actual quality of product, the post-purchase follow-ups, and let's just say I'm Persian and I'm gonna go with the typical Persian stereotype, LA stereotype. We love our BMWs. It was even a family guy, right? So I get a nice Facebook ad that shows a brown guy, Persian looking guy in a BMW. It actually works. I go there, I purchase a BMW, and then after that, that's it. Like I'm no longer, the rest of the services are not very personalized. And I find that to be a turn off. Like I want to take my car for maintenance and just, how do we, how does marketing these days especially if you're looking at it from, let's say, digital aspect, all those customer service reviews and sentiments impacts your future marketing campaigns. So how do you as a marketer work with other departments to make sure that the storytelling that you were just mentioning, your personalization, all that kind of translates through other departments? Obviously, you can't manage them or they don't report to you, but how do you work with them to ensure that, the customer service or the auto service or whatever, the brochures, they all have the same similar type of personalizations and tone?
I think that's such a good question, Alan, such a great insight because there's so much emphasis put on the pre-sale, the sale, closing the deal, right?
Mm.
The energy, the nuances, the research, the sales materials, the social, the impact, and then it's like handed off to like never, never land for the execution and the follow-up. And the reality is whether it's product marketing or point of sale, there needs to be consistency in the insights and the learning. And me as a marketer, I always felt it was really important to have collaboration across a multitude of different things. And so many times you'd have a great nugget or insight, and it was completely unknown to the next stage of the buying cycle and making sure that there's synergy and learning. And there may be something that I don't think is important of a piece of research or a sales tool that worked really well that you want to pass on to that side of the business. And they may have such a different perspective that can take and run with it. And that's the great thing with data, even with AI, by tracking and sharing and seeing what's work and sharing that across, getting data points, repeating, learning, sharing across the organization is really critical.
Data scares a lot of people off. And I guess, do you have any tips on how you can make your data and the visualization of your data more exciting rather than bars and pie charts and stuff? Is there,
Yeah.
yeah, do you have any, I would think you working, having worked for, probably you would probably be leaning more toward creating more illustrations and pictures and images and videos. And I know that type of efforts are very time consuming. So where do we kind of meet halfway to visualize our data without making it look like a boring chart or
Yeah.
graph?
Well, people want to get right to the point. I mean, even when you look at the visualization of data and how to make that simple, I think when we think of data, we need to look at the original intent, the questions that you're putting in. And I think that's a great point for people that aren't really into data to have collaboration of what is it we want to learn? Like, let's take a step back. Let's have a conversation. What do we want to learn? What do we find out about more? Because basically, garbage in, garbage out, right?
Mhm.
So, from the onset of data, bringing in various aspects, whether that's the post sale person that, sold you the car, the product person that's making the car, and I think it's really important to get buy-in and understanding of what is the objective of what we want to do with the data. That way, when you deliver the data results, you're going back to these are the 5 things that we wanted to learn. And these are the questions we're doing it. And then, I'm all into the different data platforms and spreadsheets and slicing and dicing and looking at different ways. I like to look at different demographics to see how they're reacting, different where you live, different life stages, all of that as well. Titles, if it's a B2B campaign,
Mhm.
and then coming back looking at, and then, our mind can only take so much. So here's the 5 interesting things that indexed above or beyond our expectations. This is really positive. This is really negative. Why? And then finding out a way to illustrate it, which is why you need the benefits of an amazing marketing creative person. When you get a graphic designer that has a marketing background and can take all this data and find that great way to illustrate it, it's chef's kiss. It like makes all the
Yeah.
difference to really share whether it's an infograph or some type of other mechanism. I think there's such intelligence in finding somebody that can do that. And I think it's something that people don't realize all the time. But again, I said in the beginning, we get information quicker when it's visual.
Mhm.
So having a quick takeaway, and it doesn't have to be beautiful, but something that we can process quicker and understand, and then you can dig into it a little bit more. And
Very
then, of
cool.
course,
Mhm.
data needs to have implications. So I
Yeah.
think you can't show data without insights and implications and next steps so that you can make them really actionable. I think sometimes things just fall apart that you look at the data and you're like, okay, so what? Now what do I do? How is this
Yeah.
relevant for me? What action steps can I do to implement this? And what are the expected outcomes?
data to our clients and going to be followed up. So if you don't come up with some actions from your data right away, even a few, I think that with the amount of emails business professionals receive every day, your data is going to get buried in their inbox.
Yeah, you need
Yeah,
snackable content. You
yeah.
need the full data, you need the white paper, you need the executive summary, you need the infographics, you need the video explaining it. You need the snackable content because you also digest
Hmm.
information differently. When you look at, I think 40% of the US is neurodiverse.
Yeah.
So, how are you putting data together and insights in a variety of ways that different people can get the most out of it? And it may be a video clip, it may be an infograph, it may be detail, it may be a chart to make sure that your content is resonating. And I know you're thinking, like, oh my God, how many different pieces of content do I need to make? Well, the reality is, you need to make the content that's going to really be relevant to who you're talking to, and you don't know how that is. So it's nice to kind of have that menu of options so you can digest it in the way that you're going to be able to understand it and then take action from it.
Very cool. Have you come across any AI tool that helps you visualize data better than like let's say Tableau or Looker Studio? Have you found any tool like that?
I haven't. I mean, I
Yeah,
used Looker. I've used a few other, nothing. I'd love if you hear, if anybody hears, like share it. I've played around with some presentations, some little tools that help take the visuals, but
yeah.
it's nothing that I can really,
I was
really
recommend
celebrate.
I was recommended an AI tool that it's actually a data scientist, it's more of an analysis side. So
Mm.
I haven't seen a lot of good visualization from it other than just the traditional charts and graphs. It's called Julius.ai.
Oh,
So
I'm gonna write that down now.
I'm actually sharing my screen for a minute for audience to see it too. This is what if you go to Julius.ai. Do you see my screen? Yeah.
Yeah, I do.
And then it can actually get pretty geeky. It can give you code and stuff like that. So I'm still trying it out. It also said that you can create animations. I haven't got around to that yet. Since I would love for you to like test this out and let me know later if this is
Yeah,
helpful.
bring
And
it.
they have a paid version too. Obviously, I'm using the free version, so some limitations for it. So the data seems to be pretty like I would love for your feedback if you could test that out, and if you have any data that you want to for your next project, maybe using this tool, see if it facilitates anything at all.
You mentioned earlier about how do you know what's trending? It's conversations like this, right? It's going to
Yeah,
conferences, it's meeting with people, it's collaborating, it's sharing things that really
yeah,
work. I think that's the secret. Like even
yeah.
with AI and everything happen, there's nothing like conversations and relationships and sharing great insight to make connections, to understand what's important. And I'm absolutely going to check that out and I'll report back to you with my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with you. I was actually a business advisor asked me, so last year you sponsored a bunch of conferences. Did you get any clients? I'm like, oh, I don't know if you got any clients. And it takes a while usually before you get clients in B2B. I'm like, but I networked a lot. I met a lot of cool people, a lot of knowledgeable professionals that I'm learning from. And that's where I met you at
Yeah.
one of those conferences. And now we are on a video together learning from each other. So yeah, you're right. There's no one place where you can get data, which is going to take me to my next question. Source of truth for data. Let's talk about data. What is your source of truth? And then before you answer, I was just having a call a couple of days ago with a client where they were looking at two different analytic platforms. I know we're talking about something really simple like website traffic and engagement. They were looking at the HubSpot data where it was giving a different clicks and impressions and engagement versus Google Analytics. So I think either HubSpot was overstating or Google Analytics were understating. And I told them that it's very possible that, and I know actually for a fact that Google Analytics counts the website visits and sessions differently than HubSpot. So I don't know the details of it and the different attribution differences that different platforms have. So how do you decide which source is going to be your source of truth for
particular data?
I am under the thought of you need at least three different sources. I don't trust just one. And where you see synergies, that's where there's probably that sense of truth. I think that's the world today as well,
Yeah.
right? Like there's
Yeah.
just not one source of truth anymore. And you need to look, is the source reputable? What was the methodology? Like HubSpot and Google Analytics are both very reputable. I'll look at Sprout sometimes for
Mm-hmm.
some of their social. I think their perspective is very interesting. So I tend to look at least three different sources and then gather that data. And when I see things that are similar, they can be off a few points, but when you see similar, then I take that's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
And then I
And-
always like to put my own perspective too. So when I can look at a multitude of different sources and data and then really take that time to understand, what do I think this is saying from an application standpoint? What is this saying? If we've got three different sources saying something like this, what does that mean? And kind of interpreting that. But yeah, I always do at least three. I don't
Yeah.
take anyone anymore for 100%. And obviously, there are companies that I trust,
Mhm.
that I know they do their due diligence,
Sure.
that I tend to look at.
That it's just you also want to look at patterns, right? Like if both
Mhm.
HubSpot and Google Analytics are showing the same patterns, you're going to be less concerned about the numbers and more about
Yeah.
the trend, right? So,
Yeah.
um, really valuable feedback. How do you so storytelling is a part of gathering data, understanding data, dissecting it, and telling a story. The next thing is persuasion, convincing the stakeholders to actually make some changes. Is that part of the storytelling? Is your story, while you're telling a story, are you being more persuasive, or is that like a different thing of its own?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I look at storytelling, there's the overarching narrative, like what's differentiating, why it's important, why should you care? But when you look at a sales cycle, I think it takes on average like 16 times before you get somebody to respond,
Hmm.
at least in B2B. So you need to see what part of that story is resonating, and then how do you take different parts that's going to connect, and how are you honing in on one piece of the data that you think would be relevant, and how's the way that I'm delivering it. So it could be from a B2B perspective, it could be a case study at one time, it could be a video, it could be an infograph, same with direct to consumer or CPG or whatever it is. What is the benefit and how is that story? Is it about, having frizz-free hair, to be personal? How am I getting this? And then what is important? And then maybe part of the story the next time is the fragrance, or it's free of chemicals or whatever it is, and elaborating on it and changing the story slightly. But it's constantly being out there and then understanding those nuances.
That's uh, great. Thank you. And just want to ask you about social and political climate having impact on marketing efforts in general. Like I see quite a bit of shift in our policies from one president to another president, and that has to trickle down to our marketing efforts. And how do we cope with that without offending anyone or getting our brand in trouble or, in other words, canceled? We've been approached a few times during certain holidays to say things in a certain way. Do we want to say Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays? It's just like all that's questions that come up with marketers. And sometimes I feel
Yeah.
marketers are under a lot of pressure. And when they decide wrong, then they get in trouble or fired. Do you have any insights on how to go about different political and social climates?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I don't know if they're all the right thoughts, but
Hmm.
I believe it's really important to understand your brand essence and your
Hmm.
brand values. And if you start with what are your brand values and sticking to those, then the other political, social things are there, and that impacts the way that you respond to it. So if your brand is about inclusion and being, for everyone and understanding, then that needs to be part of your message, because that's why people are buying your product. And I think sometimes when things get very political, when you're talking about DE&I or inclusion or women's rights, whatever it is, many times the brands step up. So I think
Hmm.
it really comes to who are you? What is your brand? And what are you saying is it's part of your brand? If it's not part of your brand and you're saying something, as you said, that seems forced upon because of what's happening at the moment, then that's inauthentic and everyone picks up on that. So I think you really need to understand what's important in your brand. Now, I will say there's nuances in the language. I
Mhm.
think the essence of inclusion and making sure you're acknowledging the differences that we all have is important because all the research shows people want to see themselves and that connects. So I
Yeah.
think you have to be careful of the language perhaps and the intent. Even I talk about inclusion and belonging a lot more than, maybe during Black Lives Matter
Mm.
when that language might have been a little bit different. But again, I think that's being on task of what is happening at that moment, and making sure that you're true to your brand and doing language that is relevant of that moment. But I think it really is important to understand what are your brand values and sticking to that.
So have your brand values set and just be true to your brand, be authentic, but at the same time, be considerate about the climate, maybe stay true to your values, but be flexible in your language to be
Yeah,
sensitive toward
I
every
think you
and
need to be sensitive because it could be misconstrued because that, DEI has a different connotation right now than it did maybe 6 years ago.
yeah.
So the words may be the same, but the reaction or understanding may be different, but the intent could be the same. So it's just making sure, again, it's with your brand values and the intent of what you're saying holds clear to that. One example that I actually think Getty did the right way during Black Lives Matter is it's thinking what were those statements that you want to do and how does that represent the brand? And one of the things that Getty Images had done at the time was to create a grant program for different colleges and universities, part of the HBCU, historically Black college and universities, of helping them digitize their content that they had and making it available. So, how do you take something that you provide grants and scholarships and get more stories to be told that haven't been told in a way that helps lift people up and provide value, but is still inherent to who the brand is. So I think that's an example of putting money towards a grant to help scholarships to digitize content and photos that were 50, 75 years old that no one's been ever seen and making that available is one way of I thought that was a good way of being supportive, but being on brand, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Since we're running short on time, I'm just curious with all this AI innovation that's happening, generative AI agents now, ChatGPT yesterday announced that they're releasing their first agents for their premium users, the pro users, and basically you just tell it what to do and it will do it for you. How do you, as a marketer, first, how do you keep up with AI? And how do you avoid the shiny object syndrome that a lot of people have with technology adoption? Like how do you use AI properly and how do you keep up?
I think AI is amazing when it comes to brainstorming, when it comes to editing thoughts, for automation, for repetitive tasks, but they still need the human eye. I mean, I use ChatGPT all the time
Mhm.
as a starting point, double checking grammar, putting out lines, but then I still change it. But it does definitely save time. And I think that it just needs to be used in a way that is, again, brainstorming, helping, or automative tasks and that piece of it. I think where you still need to be really careful, especially when it comes to shiny objects, is when it comes to generative AI. And I think that's something that you need to understand that what's being created started from something that was somebody's intellectual property. And I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what that means.
Mhm.
And you have to be very careful of lawsuits, when you
Yeah.
look at generative AI and you ask it to search things and they actually pull trademarks of products that exist. I think you have to be really careful
Yeah.
and of what you're doing. I mean, we used a lot of generative AI in creating some videos. It was
Mhm.
amazing. We recorded a CEO of a company and created videos. He spoke all of a sudden 15 languages, and it really
Yeah.
was a very cost-effective way to kind of personalize messages. It wasn't perfect, but it was great. But
Mhm.
that had permission from the speaker. It was all done versus creating a video that's 100% Gen AI. You have to think about when it comes to Gen AI, especially when it comes to visuals, it's looking backwards. It's always pulling images and videos from the past. So when it comes to stereotypes, you
Mhm.
need to be really careful because it's using tropes and old stereotypes that we've kind of moved past and now we're moving backwards. There was a presentation that I saw given by a former colleague of mine, Katie Calhoun, who gave this presentation that I sat in talking about generative AI. And it was a real estate company testing out show me an agent. I want her to be blonde in an orange suit. And when I tell you the two images that came out were so overly sexualized, like the
Yeah.
woman wasn't wearing a shirt. And
Mhm.
the scary part was the person that, did the demo of showing it didn't even realize how, there was this huge stereotype of what a real estate agent looks like. And I think
Mhm.
that's something you need to be really careful. Or if you go and you put in, show me what a CEO looks like, and they're all 50-year-old
Male.
white
Right.
men.
Yeah.
Same when you put doctor, anesthesiologist, they are all 50-year-old white men.
Yeah, I have a funny story to tell you. When I was playing around with ChatGPT, the Canva, the visual
Yep.
part of it, we use it, a creative team use different tools. I was just playing around with it. I'm like, give me again, maybe in Persian, I'm like, draw a Persian guy. And he basically draw a guy that sitting on a carpet, drinking tea, and the next to him there was a camel, and I'm like, I think the first time I ever saw a camel was in the States. I'd never seen, but like I think it was a zoo or something like that. I'd never seen camel in Iran. I'm not saying they don't exist. If you go to the south of Iran, the desert, but I didn't live there. I lived in the capital. So I'm 100% agree with you. For me it was funny because I was just playing around with it, but you gotta be very careful with generative content in general, like the copyrights you mentioned. I
Yeah.
even code, a lot of programmers take shortcuts and they use ChatGPT code. Some of that code could be someone else's little line by line intellectual properties. So maybe you can use it as a guide, but you don't copy paste. So
Exactly,
yeah.
100%. It's great for brainstorming, for ideation,
Hmm.
but you have to be really careful about intellectual property and copyright and those ramifications. And then, again, what are the data sources, especially when it comes to, Gen AI? Where are they pulling the data from?
Sure.
And you can really open yourself
And
up
sometimes they just
to.
make it up, which we call it hallucinations. It looks correct, but
It's
it's
in
not
the
really
tea.
correct. Exactly. Well, I know this podcast was very insightful for me. The time flew by. I just realized we are running out of time.
Oh, yeah.
Where do we find you? Where do our audience find you? How they can connect to you, and what kind of services do you offer?
You can find me right now on LinkedIn is the best way to connect with me, and it's Paige McCrensky. Really simple, LinkedIn, PAIGEMCCRENSKY. The name is Storytelling Catalyst Group, but I am in development of my site right now. But basically, the services that I offer are as simple as project-based, fractional CMO work, marketing and sales collateral, growth marketing. I also have done a lot of workshops. So I've done workshops on Gen AI, I've done workshops on visual storytelling, I've done inclusion marketing workshops, which are great to do with your in-house teams. I've done them with agencies and clients together. And I think that's a great way to actually get in, do some workshops, have it really engaging and interactive. I do a lot of panels and hands-on, and that's an opportunity as well. And I work with a network of other consultants as part of it, including some amazing researchers, AI specialists, et cetera. So please, and just connect. I'd love to reach out and meet other people that have similar or different thoughts and collaborate and have conversations.
Wonderful. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, and appreciate your time. Hopefully, we can have you on again in the near future.
I'd love it. Thank you again
Thank,
for inviting me. It went.
thank you so much. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.